So just by way of opening, I have to admit that when I was reading your book, it's very interesting to read a book and know that you're going to get the opportunity to write down the thoughts it raises in your head and ask the author. You don't get that opportunity very often, but I also don't want to only focus this on what I am interested in. So I certainly have questions I'd like to ask Professor Pickett, but if any of you have thoughts that you would also like to ask her, please feel free to come to one of the mics in the center, and I'll try to restrain my enthusiasm and my questions to let others ask questions. So just by way of opening, I think the data you have is irrefutable. It's very hard to look at it and say there's not a correlation. And it also feels incredibly topical to the point of sort of today's reporting on the Today Show that I look at the Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Boston, et cetera, as a phenomenon that seems to be tied to the whole issue of inequality. Am I looking at this correctly?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that in the US and in the UK, over the past 2-3 decades, we've seen rapidly rising levels of inequality, and yet we've sort of been generally unaware of them. In the British Social Attitudes Survey, year after year after year, the public are asked to describe what they think the salary is of a chief executive of a large company. What do they think the salary is of somebody who works on the factory floor? And they tend to really underestimate the gap, the actual gap. And when they're asked what they think those salaries should be, they want to narrow a gap even than what they think is there. And so I think in general we're really unaware of the scale of inequality in society, and have been for a long time, because the political debates have focused very much on poverty, on what's been going on at the bottom, and not so much on the runaway salaries, the bonus culture that's driven the pulling apart of incomes across the scale. And I think the global financial crash, and for us in the UK, the scandal of our MPs' expenses, suddenly brought issues of inequality to the fore. Watching the behaviour of bankers, watching the damage done to society by that growing inequality, suddenly that's changed the nature of the political debate. And I mean, I'd like to think that our book has contributed a tiny piece of that. The reason we wrote it was because for decades we'd been writing academic papers showing these relationships in the peer-reviewed journals. Nobody reads them. And yet daily we would see the kinds of problems we were interested in being discussed without inequality coming up as a possible root cause. So I think the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, which are going on all over the world, and indeed the riots that we saw in the UK, are responses to a growing public unease about the level of inequality in society that's been masked for a long, long time.
And I can totally understand why the corporate CEO, people might not perceive the gap, but I also was struck as I read it that there are places where the gap is obvious. One of the elements in Professor Pickett's book that was great was Clark Gable's annual salary in today's dollars, when he was a big star, was $600,000 a year. It's either 6 or 8, I think it was 6. And you compare that to the reports we get today where Jennifer Aniston makes $7 million for this picture, or a pitcher for a sports team signs a $15 million contract. So those are areas where the rising gap is incredibly obvious, yet market forces don't seem to work, that no one is saying, I'm not going to go see the Red Sox because it's preposterous that I have to pay $80 for a ticket so someone can make $7 million a year.
Yes, I think we all sort of get sucked into it, don't we, and get rather bamboozled by celebrity status. I think even among the very, very rich, there's little awareness of how different they are to the rest of us. A British journalist did work with the super rich, people who are in the top 1% of 1% of the income distribution, and most of them would just describe themselves as middle class and doing okay. And I think most of us here in this room are probably in the US distribution of income right up there at the top, and yet we tend not to feel it because we see the very pinnacles of super richness and celebrity culture. I think we do tend to look at the national distribution of incomes, the scale of social differences, the scale of class differentiation across the whole society, and know reasonably well where we sit. But I think we do all sort of tend to overestimate how much we have in relation to the vast majority.
Well, and I think your point actually about people sort of buying into the celebrity culture, another of the sections of the book I thought was quite interesting is there's an underlying theme of sort of I trust people like me and sort of the community. And one of the experiments in the book talks about doing work with Indian boys and how they perform and the issue of caste. And could you sort of talk a bit about that? Because it's quite striking how it played out.
Yes, this is an experiment that researchers from the World Bank did in India. They brought schoolboys into a testing center and they asked them to solve puzzles, mazes. You know those ones where you find your way from the outside into the middle? And they had to solve as many as they could in a short period of time. And when the boys didn't know each other's caste, they performed equally well, the low caste boys and the high caste boys. And then they had to go around and announce which caste they belonged to, and then they redid the puzzle experiment. And the performance of the low caste boys plummeted. And psychologists call this stereotype threat. So if you belong to a group or have characteristics that you believe are judged negatively by others, then that affects the way you think, your cognitive performance, it affects the way you feel, so it affects your physiology, and it affects the way you behave. And American researchers have shown the same things with African American and white college students and high school students, that they do equally well in a testing situation until told that the tests are tests of intelligence, which provokes a stereotype for the African American kids that makes their performance fall. And I'm afraid, ladies, that we do the same. For tests of maths and spatial ability, we will do just as well as men in a testing situation until told that science has shown that men's brains are better at this, and then our performance tails off. And in fact, we do worse if we simply check a box at the beginning of the test to say whether we're male or female. If we tick that box at the end of the test, we do fine. If we tick that box female at the beginning, we do less well. So these are very, very powerful influences on us, how we feel we're judged by others. And, we have an evolved sensitivity to the way other people see us, to the quality of our social relationships. We do sort of judge one another. We are social animals. We're constantly sort of feeling our way. And it's through the eyes of others that we know ourselves, and that we are socialized. And so in a more hierarchical society where status matters more, those sensitivities are enhanced and become much, much more pervasive, I think, and potentially damaging.
So it's interesting, and I'm not sure if it follows to my next question or not. You'll have to tell me that the community does seem to be part of all of this, and how you interact with your community, and possibly, as you said, even what is your role in the community. And for some reason, because you're a woman, therefore you are more competent than I am as a man, and I would therefore act accordingly. But one of the things that I felt as I was reading your book, and it's actually an odd comment to bring at this particular symposium, how much is technology and computers and email and smartphones started to break down that sense of community, that I don't even have the reinforcement of that community. I noticed the other day that my nephew, who's 18, has 2,100 friends on Facebook. I would argue he has completely lost the concept of what a friend is. Yet that may be who he feels the group is that he attaches to. So how is technology impacting how we view ourselves with relation to society and inequality?
Gosh, this feels a little bit outside my area of expertise. I don't have 2,100 friends on Facebook.
I think you have to be under 20 to have 2,100 friends on Facebook.
I think, the work of Robin Dunbar, who's an evolutionary psychologist, has suggested that actually we tend to do best. We can't really handle group sizes of I think of more than about, is it 50 or 100 sort of tribe size? And that for friendship, once you get to about 15, I think that's known as Dunbar's number, we don't really manage a larger number of sort of intimate social relationships. I would bet that of your son's 2,100 Facebook friends, that there's a core group with whom he's more interactive. And that label of friends won't apply the same to everybody he discusses with. In some ways, I think technology enhances our opportunities to know one another, to make social connections. My daughter, who's had a sort of sadly transatlantic existence, manages to maintain friendship groups on both sides of the Atlantic through technology in ways that would not have been possible for children in the past. And also, I've noticed that my son, who, if we call him socially awkward, that would be a kind way of putting it, is able to find friendship groups online that he might not have access to in other ways. And online, that there's a little niche for everybody. So I don't think of computerized communication as necessarily replacing in negative ways that functioning, but I suppose what's astonishing about computers is how rapidly the technology has evolved from us just wanting to crunch numbers, which is where we started, to us actually wanting to do what feels much more human and basic to us, which is to connect, which is to exchange feelings as well as information. So I don't have any expertise actually in social media or technologies, but I would view it as, for some people, opening up the world for them and opening up the possibilities of connection.
Although I will say in your presentation, I did notice in the first slide of the unhappy people outside the tube station, several of them were on their cell phones.
They were all on their cell phones, yeah.
And at the end slide, where you have a happy community, nobody was on their cell phone.
That's true.
So I feel like there is potentially something there to be discussed. So another thought, and let me pause actually. Does anyone want to jump up and grab the mic and ask Professor Pickett a question? Please, go right ahead.
I love your observations about the polarization in this country, red states, blue states, and the idea that half of the country seems to say, don't tax us, small government, leave us alone, and half says, no, we have a country here, we need to be responsible for others, but people's income is not distributed half and half. And so it's just baffling to me, and looking at your study and your data is very exciting as an opportunity. So I guess two questions. One is how you observe sort of what's going on in this country, and secondly, what can be done using your evidence that this is really heading us in a terrible direction, and how would you suggest politicians take this and President Obama use your data?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I mean, you have got incredible political polarization right now in the United States, whereas in the UK we're all fighting over the centre ground. So we're doing politics in a slightly different way at the moment, and everybody's fighting to be seen to be the ones who agree with everybody else. I think that the key is what I referred to just towards the end of my talk earlier, that there are lots and lots of different ways in which societies can become more or less equal. Governments, whether they're state governments, local governments, national governments, can hardly move without affecting the levels of inequality in society. And so there are both ways that would be viewed as ideologically liberal, progressive, such as increasing progressive taxation, increasing the role of the welfare state, and focusing on bringing, I suppose, reducing top incomes through taxation and constraint, and improving bottom incomes through things like living wages, minimum wages, improvements, and benefits, that's going to appeal to only one side of the political spectrum. But there are mechanisms that I think appeal to the other side, which are more to do with economic democracy, mechanisms for increasing economic democracy within the workplace, whether it's through cooperatives, mutuals, employee representation on remuneration committees, those sorts of things, where you work to actually shift an institution from being a piece of property into being more of a community of individuals with shared aspirations and shared entrepreneurial vision. And there's no reason why those sorts of mechanisms or those sorts of policies can't appeal to those on the other end of the political spectrum, because, of course, those enhance individual aspiration, individual capability, and individual responsibility. So that there's no one way. And I highlighted the difference between Japan and Sweden, that they achieved their equality through very, very different mechanisms. And the same, I think, is true in the US. You know, if you compare New Hampshire and Vermont, which in the data we're using do very, very well in their levels of health and social problems, and they're both very equal compared to other states, but they do that through different mechanisms, with New Hampshire behaving rather more like Japan and Vermont behaving rather more like Sweden. So I think within any political system, within any society, there is this range of options. And so I wouldn't simply say that there are messages for President Obama in what he might think to do about reducing inequality and improving the well-being of the US population. There ought to be things that the Republicans, indeed the Tea Party, might look at these data and say, you know what, actually, we do want to improve the well-being of the whole society. Inequality is damaging. What are the things we could do? And not feel that actually politically or policy-wise, it's a closed box that only appeals to one side of the political spectrum.
But from everything you just said, and I have to admit, when I was looking at your slides, I immediately wrote down taxation as I think on the right side of your slide. It does sound like you're saying, however, it will require a conscious, thoughtful action and effort to do this. This is not something that a society can self-correct, or I guess I would even say can correct without some fairly major changes. That the idea that we're going to do sort of this little incremental thing, we're going to change a tax rate by 1%, but that if you really want to stop this tide, does it require something fairly dramatic?
Well, I suppose if you want to go from one end of the equality spectrum to the other, then you would have to do something rather drastic. If you wanted to suddenly develop the levels of inequality of Sweden, for instance, you would need drastic action if you wanted to do it quickly. But I think what's really interesting is that if we were looking at similar data from 50, 60 years ago, you would find that the USA and Japan were on completely different ends of the distribution. So that the US used to be one of the most equal countries in the developed world, and its health performance, was extremely strong in comparison to other societies, whereas Japan was incredibly hierarchical and had very, very poor health. And now they since the Second World War, have completely changed places. And of course, there are countries at every level of inequality between them, so it might not require massive shifts for the UK or the US to become a Canada or a France, although it might take a lot more for us to become a Sweden or a Japan. And because you can see this strong, statistically significant correlation, small changes, incremental changes, could be expected to have quite large benefits, and not just for health, but across a whole spectrum of social problems on which we all spend huge amounts of money in both sort of primary prevention terms and secondary, tertiary sort of treatment terms in lots of different sectors. So I think the cost of doing nothing is very high. Does it require a huge commitment and a massive, massive scale of intervention. Possibly, and in the past we have seen countries like Sweden making a conscious decision to become a more equal society, to become what they call the people's home. But just within the past couple of decades, our societies have become massively more unequal without anybody taking a conscious decision that was okay. That followed on a neoliberal economic ideology that wasn't about increasing inequality. It's a sort of an accidental byproduct of those things and changed very rapidly. So again, I'm fairly optimistic that things can be done and that the first step is knowledge. If we know the scale of income differences in our societies and we can see the evidence that they constrain our well-being for our whole populations, that's the first step to demanding political change. And it would be very nice if political change were led by visionary political leaders, but they don't always do that for us. And some of the progress that we've seen in social terms over the last century, improvements in the position of women, improvements in the position of ethnic minorities or sexual minority groups or religious tolerance, they haven't come about because somebody in government decided to hand us those rights or improvements. They've come about because as a society we demanded them in a grassroots way. And so the educational aspect of this work I think is really important. If we understand the damage done to us all by greater levels of inequality, then we can start to recognize it, discuss, push for change in a more grassroots way. But I don't expect things will change tomorrow. I mean, for the long haul.
So to take the, I think to pick up on what you just said, several years ago I was on a grand jury and spent 3 months full-time hearing criminal cases, which that'll bring you down. But one of the things that struck me was, and this was, I live in Suffolk County, so for those of you who are local, it was inner city Boston, primarily crime. A lot of it was drugs, a lot of it was violence. And what struck me with case after case after case, if you live in a society where, or if you feel you live in a world where there is absolutely no hope, my lot will never improve, I am stuck, then you're sort of left with immediate gratification. So you looked at me the wrong way, I'll shoot you. That'll feel good for about 60 seconds, that's good. Or drugs. If that takes care of the next hour, fine. So I hadn't really thought about it till you read your book, but as one of the most crushing, I guess, of all those social ills is the social mobility one, that once you feel you are locked there, we will never improve crime or drug use or anything else until there is some sense that there is social mobility. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think it is a fair conclusion. And I think, it's not just about gratification, I'll feel better. It is about what is the source of feeling bad in the first place, the source of feeling disrespected or of low social status or that feeling of hopelessness. That is very, very damaging. And in our book, we quote the work of James Gilligan, who is a prison psychiatrist who's worked for decades with the most violent of offenders, who says he has never come across an act of violence that wasn't triggered by a person's sense of disrespect, feeling lack of respect. And the reason that, you and I don't come to blows or react with violence if somebody argues with us or disagrees with us or looks at us funny is because we have the trappings of status that allow us to feel good about ourselves, whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think these are the root causes of violence, the root causes of children having children. For our young men, it's often to react with violence or crime, but for our young women, it's often to look for pathways into adulthood through early motherhood. And so we are sort of seeing a stifling of opportunity for vast numbers of our young people because we don't offer them opportunities for social mobility. We certainly don't offer them equality of opportunity. In the UK, if you look at when the social class, socioeconomic differences in development start to appear, they're by age 3. They're as clear as daylight by age 3. So even before children enter preschool, you're seeing differences in cognitive development that have popped up because of the social status of their parents, the kinds of neighborhoods they live in, the social environment in which they're parenting, the stresses that imposes. So we set that structure. The impact of inequality gets felt very, very early on in ways that hamper and marginalize vast numbers of our kids.
Age 3, that is very discouraging, I have to say. There was another question down in the front. Yeah.
Regarding sort of on the micro level, on the micro level of an individual, is there any sort of characteristics? Are there any characteristics that empower or make less powerless individuals of lower caste or these groups that, when faced with knowing that you're female or of a lower class, is there any areas where that performance difference does not exist despite that inequality? And is there any evidence of things that could be done to allow the lower caste individuals to not be impacted by the inequality as much?
So I think what you're asking me is about resilience, yes? What are the factors that might make people resilient to the damages of inequality? Well, we know how important early childhood is. And the quality of family life can really matter, which is why we all know of anecdotal stories that buck these trends. We will all, President Obama being perhaps a good example, we all know of stories of kids who do well against the odds, who manage to achieve their aspirations despite the poverty or deprivation of their backgrounds. And I think a nurturing family environment can be key to that. But I'm less interested, I suppose, in what individual factors might be that help tiny minorities of people resist this, and much more interested in the bigger picture of what the societal level factors are that damage us as a whole, because that's where I think we need to act, and that's where the traction is. If, for instance, investment in early childhood programs for the poorest kids are helpful, but we don't do anything about the social environment that means those children need them most, then we will need them forever. Someone used an analogy that it's a bit like when you leave your bathroom faucet on and the tub is overflowing and you go running into the bathroom with a little mop and you mop around the edges, and that's as a society what we tend to do. You know, we react to the problem of violence by wanting more police, or we react to problems of health by spending more on healthcare, and we don't actually go and turn off the tap. So I think if we feel that the evidence is compelling enough that levels of inequality are damaging, then it behooves us to try and do something about that, because the payoff is beyond the individual family and it's beyond the sector that we might be interested in. Here it's health, but for other people it's levels of juvenile crime, and for others it's to do with human capital development and the economic capabilities of our societies. And so there are lots of different reasons to sort of turn off that tap, creating that social dysfunction. Not sure that's a very satisfactory answer to your question. I apologize.
Are we getting the hook?
Well, it's time. I see there's one question there. You can take one question.
Sure.
Or you can...
For 25 million people in the U.S., depending on whose numbers you believe, the most significant positive event towards well-being would be getting a job. And Andrew Berg, I just tweeted a study he did showing that income equality improves growth and extends growth over longer periods of time, thus creating more jobs. Is your work also suggestive of a virtuous cycle that would add trust and innovation and collaboration to the equation, such that those would be supports and drivers of growth and job creation and well-being? And could you suggest whether any of your work is suggestive of how that works and how it could be used to persuade politicians how job creation actually happens, as opposed to how they think it happens?
That's quite a long one. Let me try and do it as quickly as I can. I think, the evidence that links inequality to economic growth has in the past been rather mixed. And a lot of economists in the past have always felt that you need a certain degree of inequality to drive growth, because otherwise you don't get enough people aspiring to do better, striving to get ahead, that you will stifle creativity without a certain level of inequality. I think the modern economic thinking is much, much more flexible on this, and since the global financial crash has really sort of come around the other way, and there are a number of leading economists now drawing those links between equality and economic growth, and equality and human capital formation, including the work of James Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, that our societies flourish and create a more capable workforce, and therefore more work opportunities and more ability to take up those opportunities with greater equality. So I think there are virtuous cycles as well, whereby social cohesion, social interaction, enhanced levels of trust mean that more people are going to be in favor of collective action that supports the capabilities of the vast majority. But I do also think that it is greater equality that creates that climate where social cohesion improves, and that the direction of flow is primarily that way. So I do think there is work that shows that if you reduce income differences and actually shift the social pyramid from looking like this to looking more like this, then you do increase social cohesion, you do improve trust and community cooperation, and that then has spin-off benefits. And I'm sure that we can get into vicious cycles of competition, individualism, materialism, and striving, or we can get into virtuous cycles of more cooperation and more sharing. And as human beings, we're quite flexible. We can operate in every kind of society. We have survived under the most dictatorial tyrannies and also in the most egalitarian, caring, sharing societies. We adapt and can manage both, but we seem to flourish most and in largest numbers when we adopt the more collaborative, sharing and cooperative side of our human nature than when we develop the more competitive, every man for himself strategy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Pickett and Al.
Thank you very much.